Hello there guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you guys are well. I hope that you're doing safe as always, wherever you are listening to us around the world. First race of the season in the bag, and it was a dominant display by the reigning defending champions Red Bull, with Max Verstappen forgiven for thinking that he wasn't even in the race. He was certainly there, and he was very quick, dominating the race from start to finish, winning the opening round of the season. Believe it or not, his first victory at the Bahrain Grand Prix after 9 attempts, very much setting the standard for everybody else on the grid with the Red Bull team. Sergio Perez completing a 1-2 for Red Bull, never really looked in doubt as far as the second half of the race is concerned. There are plenty of stories, however, to go through the grid up and down, most of it coming from behind Red Bull. But of course, the biggest headline of them all, Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin getting a well-deserved podium for an impressive Aston Martin team that have looked incredibly quick since pre-season. They confirmed their pace today. Could they be the second fastest team on the grid based on what we saw this weekend? They very may well be. Joining us on the episode, the DNF1 panel are back to review and discuss all of the big talking points following this weekend's Bahrain Grand Prix. We have Courtney Pine and Lee Wallington. Gentlemen, first of all, great to have us all back together for the first race of the season. We knew that Red Bull were the favourites and were likely to dominate this weekend's Grand Prix and set a marker, or the gauntlet if you like, to every other team on the grid who wants to try and take their championship crown off them. But could anyone imagine that Red Bull would be as dominant as they were this weekend? You could be forgiven for thinking that they weren't even there because they were just so far ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to be too negative, but it was all too easy for Red Bull. I don't want to take credit away from them. They've done a fantastic job since last season, but I'm looking behind them, particularly at the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes. And they simply need to up their game. Like, for me, the job that they're putting in simply isn't good enough. It's way too easy for Red Bull. And at the same time, now you've got Aston Martin coming into the mix. Again, fair play to Aston Martin. But for me, it just highlights that there are problems, big problems of Ferrari and Mercedes. Little rant over.
Yeah, of course, there's a lot to be talking about with Ferrari and Mercedes. You know, arguably the same issue to a certain degree, although Ferrari probably a little bit more than just the fact that they're not as quick as they would have hoped to have been compared to Red Bull, but plenty to talk about there. Lee, of course, this come to you as well. Red Bull starting the weekend looking very impressive. We didn't know how quick they were going to be compared to their rivals, and I think not only Max Verstappen's pace, but Sergio Perez's pace, particularly in the second half of that race, just proved that no matter what strategy the other teams could throw at them, Red Bull could pretty much do what they wanted to and still get the W.
Oh yeah, the performance from that car was impressive, and I think, as you highlighted, I think the key thing with Sergio, we always know Max can get performance out of a car, and that's to be expected. But the performance Sergio delivered shows that the car is probably easier to drive than last year. That Sergio can extract that performance, right? Maybe not the same that Max can, but it's still an improvement and a step up for Sergio. So it is a worry for the season in regards to what Red Bull can bring to the table. But maybe this is the step that Sergio, or is it Sergio 2.0 now, or are we going down the Valtteri route of 3.0, 4.0? Maybe Sergio can make it a bit more interesting. And if Charles hadn't got the jump on him at the start, what could have Sergio done to annoy Max? That's a very big unknown question.
And that's something that if this Red Bull team continue to dominate the races this season as they have done this weekend, and of course, you know, we can't say that that's not going to happen, but, you know, at this point in time on the evidence of what we've seen, there's no reason why it shouldn't. We'll obviously get more answers to those questions. Will Perez be allowed to challenge Verstappen? Will he be able to upset the balance a little bit on days where he's a little bit more competitive compared to what he was last season when he was in that position and obviously asked to make way for his teammate who was chasing a championship, with all due respect? First things first, I think we need to talk about the pace of these cars this year and the overall field spread. Based on what we saw in qualifying, one stat that we got from Mark Lane F1, obviously people that know in the F1 well, Mark Lane, very respectable engineer. They're obviously doing a lot of reporting on social media these days. He mentioned that it was only 1.1 seconds covering the entire grid after Q1. Now, of course, we should throw in the caveat that the Q3 times of the top teams would have been more fair representation than Q1 times would have been, because they would have been considerably faster, and they were. But even still, that's not a bad field spread. The rules, I suppose, are having the desired effect in terms of bringing the field closer together, even if one team is outstandingly dominant right now.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Adam. Other than Red Bull, and I think I might have mentioned this in the preview, actually. If you used to take Red Bull, if they were just to, if you snap your finger, snap that Infinity Gauntlet, and that made Red Bull disappear, we'd actually have quite an entertaining grid. There's actually a lot of teams that are quite close to each other. I think most notably Mercedes and Aston Martin right now, and possibly Ferrari on a bad day. So you're right. Other than Red Bull scampering away in the distance and like referencing the Max thing, I know we're probably hoping that Perez will give us some kind of title battle, give Max some bother. I think for me, I'm not in denial about this. Max is in a completely different stratosphere right now. I think the title race itself is going to be, unless Ferrari and Mercedes in particular really go on a sharp development curve, it's going to be a repeat of last year. Max is in a completely different stratosphere. Whether the car's more drivable or not for Sergio, Max is unbeatable right now. But with the rest of the grid, we could have some interesting stories coming up this year. I mean, most notably in the midfield, we've seen some of the teams that were doing better last season, the season before, struggling, whilst others seem to have upped their game. So the main interest this season, yet again, will probably be in the sort of, for the most of the grid, apart from the team leading it at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we should obviously stress that there are a lot of similarities that we can draw from what we saw this weekend with Red Bull to what we saw throughout a lot of the 2020 season with Mercedes when they were dominating. It's a very similar picture, although we obviously have to remember this is the first race. Bahrain, as much as we want to draw conclusions on the pecking order from Bahrain, very, very rarely is Bahrain a reflection of what the real hierarchy is on the Formula One grid. Quite often it tends to exaggerate some strengths more than others. So perhaps, and this is quite hopeful more than expected at this point in time after what we've just seen from Red Bull, the field spread might be a little bit closer, or the other teams immediately behind Red Bull might be a little bit more competitive at certain other circuits. And of course, as you said, Courtney, there's going to be a steep development curve this year. The second year in these new regulations, from what we've seen, has brought the field a little bit closer. Hopefully, we will continue to see that. And that will also include Red Bull as well as everybody else. Lee, the other big story we've got to take from qualifying, as you kind of alluded to from the start of the race, Charles Leclerc and Ferrari, despite the fact they were only a tenth off Verstappen's time at the time in P2, abandoned their final run. A lot of us thought there was an issue with the car, that Ferrari obviously did not want to send Leclerc out because it would have been pointless, but they decided to hold back a set of soft tyres. Now, the strategy was confusing, but when they all started the race on the softs, they put him on a fresh set of soft tyres, which nobody else in the top 10 had. It did the job. It got him ahead of P2, got him ahead of Perez. At that point in time, what did you make of that call for Ferrari to save a set of soft tyres, which allowed Leclerc to get the jump on Perez and kind of disrupt the balance at Red Bull?
I think it was actually a very good decision. We were saying in our reviews of last season the things that Ferrari need to improve on this year. One of the things is strategy, and with strategy is thinking outside the box. They could have used the tyres from qualifying, gone, yeah, we should try it. It's a 10th. We may do it, we may not. We probably won't do it. Let's something out of the box. But worst case scenario, obviously worst case scenario, the car stalls and they don't actually go anywhere. But realistically, worst case scenario, they still third on the grid going into the first corner. Not so bad. Let's try it. Let's think something different. And it worked. And that's something that I like to see for Ferrari is the thinking outside the box, trying something different. Admittedly, I don't want the throwing points away needlessly, but the fact that they tried it and it worked, I think is a credits off and or hat off to Ferrari in this instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, a lot of people probably say, oh, well, Ferrari are just saying that to put the line out that there was no issue with their car. Charles Leclerc confirmed it himself that there wasn't any issue and that they felt that they weren't really in the fight for pole position, despite being so close. And of course, Charles losing out to Perez on the front row of the grid. They acknowledged that they were behind on race pace. We didn't realise how far behind they were. Of course, it became very obvious how far behind they and everybody else were behind Red Bull, especially Max Verstappen. They had no choice but to try and disrupt the order, if you like, and try and get ahead of both cars if they could with those tyres, they managed to get Perez. And for the opening stint of the race, Charles Leclerc did a very good job. It looked like whilst Verstappen was scampering away, Leclerc at the very least could use the strengths of the Ferrari to hold Perez back. So I think I agree. You have to give Ferrari credit where credit's due on that one. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for them in the end, but they were certainly trying something different. So it's always good to see when that comes off. We do also have to talk about the other element at the start with the two Ferraris and Sergio Perez. That was quite dicey because there was I had flashbacks to Singapore 2017 with that one. I'm not going to lie. We had Perez and Leclerc fighting each other to get in Verstappen slipstream behind them for P2, Sainz on the other side, and Leclerc probably squeezing Perez a little bit, but obviously wasn't aware that Carlos Sainz was alongside Perez. So we very nearly had a repeat of that incident, didn't we, Colt?
Yeah, the flashback to Singapore 2017 is pretty spot on, and I couldn't help but chuckle because you sometimes forget about these events, but you just reminded me that it happened, and it just gave me a cheeky little smile. So apologies for that, Adam. That was a moment that the 2017 title charge fell apart, wasn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately so. I mean, I don't want to draw comparisons and say that Bahrain 2023 is where Ferrari's title charge fell away after one race, but we'll have to wait and see. I mean, if we're clutching at straws here, the driver that wins the Bahrain Grand or the opening race of the season hasn't gone on to win the World Championship, and as we saw last season, Max Verstappen got a DNF, Red Bull double DNF in that race, and they went on to win both championships in dominant fashion, whereas Ferrari 1-2 faltered away. Not quite sure Red Bull are going to let it slip that easily, but we'll have to wait and see. Going back to Red Bull before we move on to some other teams, as I said, the pace of their car reminded me very much of Mercedes 2020. A lot of the Schumacher era at Ferrari when they dominated. I think Crofty or Martin Brundle said on Sky F1 commentary today, it very much was similar to that, where they were just so fast. They could do any strategy that they wanted to do. And they proved that today with a two-stopper. We thought a lot of teams might do a one-stop, but they ended up doing the two-stopper, going soft, hard. It was a bit of a surprise, but I think it just showed that even if they lost track position because the other teams tried to do the one-stop, they still were going to be able to overhaul them very quickly. I think it's just a testament to how brilliant the Red Bull race pace is right now.
Yeah, it's the car, well, obviously the engineered build car, it's just a masterpiece of engineering, and it's obviously come out of the box with 3 days of testing and bam, here it is. You've got to give them all credit due to building such an amazing car.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it's early to say at this point in time. We've only had one season and one race out of these new regulations, but I remember what Ted Kravitz from Sky F1 said during pre-season testing, and that quite often in these regulation sets, especially one as prescriptive as these ones are, and it's basically that there's always one concept, there's one parallel line that you have to go down in order to achieve the ultimate performance of a set of regulations. At this point in time, it does very much seem that Red Bull are the ones that have struck gold with the concept that they've gone down, unsurprisingly, in some regards. Is this the one, guys? Is this the concept that everybody else is going to have to go down to? And if so, is there anyone that can stop Red Bull right now at this point in time?
Aston Martin.
Yeah, may well be, maybe. But
no, you have a look at Ferrari. The potential's there. Look, we've been saying since the beginning of last year. The potential's there. They just need to iron out the creases. But it just seems like it seems that those creases are quite stubborn. They keep on trying. We think they've got there, and obviously they're still there. We saw the DNF by Leclerc, and were any of us surprised by it? Probably not. It just seems to be like a continuation of 2022, which is quite frustrating. I think Mercedes have the resources and the personnel to catch up. But I know we'll probably go on to later on. But I remember when we was going through the cars and the testing review, I saw too many physical similarities to the W13, and I thought, I don't understand why they're still going down this road when quite clearly it didn't work last season. I know there's talk about them going to a plan B. I just feel this hard pod concept doesn't work. They need to get rid of it, because the longer they leave it, the further beyond they're going to fall.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, Corny, because I think we do need to talk about this Mercedes issue with their current concept and what do they do going forward. Incidentally, guys, of course, if you are new to the YouTube channel, please do support us by subscribing, liking the video. As always, if you're new, we really appreciate new followers and we love welcoming new people to the DNF1 family. Of course, if you think that we are worthy of a 5-star review on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to do that for us. It really does help us out a lot. It helps us do what we do, and we cannot thank you enough for your undying continuous support with the channel so far. Moving back to the issue at hand, Courtney, as you mentioned already, Toto Wolff was quite stern with his words on this Mercedes concept. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from him, if I may. Basically saying the concept is not as strong as we thought it was. We are 1 second off in the long run. We are not happy. He then went on to say after the race, basically, that there was not a single positive thing that they could take from this race. We're lacking pace. The drivers have to push all the time, and that is hurting the tyres. Red Bull is on another planet. Aston Martin currently has the second quickest car. It was a real wake-up call for us. So, Lee, Courtney's already obviously made his thoughts on this one already. I wanted to get your thoughts on this one because Mercedes, over the winter break, there was a lot of questions, probably more so than for any other team, on what design philosophy they were going to pursue for 2023. Were they going to abandon the one that they had brought in 2022, the Hyde Pod concept, and evolve it or improve it to a point where actually it could challenge Ferrari and even Red Bull in this case for the top honours? Or were they going to abandon it in the same way that Aston Martin did much earlier in the 2022 season and adopt a more Red Bull-like approach? As we see right now, Aston Martin, with the limited resources that they have compared to the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes, went down the Red Bull route. And right now, Toto Wolff, and a lot of people probably will come away feeling this way, currently have the second fastest car overall. So with that in mind, what did Mercedes do? Because they've committed a lot of money and time, resource, staffing, and ideas to the concept they've pursued. And right now, if they adopted the Red Bull program, it's going to cost them a lot of money. It's going to cost them time, which they don't really have. And they're already sacrificing 2023 and maybe some of 2024 as well till they get to a point where they can start challenging again for titles.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation that Mercedes find themselves in. And you can even potentially add Ferrari into that question as well. Just quickly go back to what you said about Ted Carrott said in testing. The old generation of rules from 2014 to 21, there were really two concepts that worked. There was the Mercedes concept where they dominated, and the Red Bull concept, which most of the field copied. No one copied Mercedes, even though they were the champion. But in this era now, I think it's proven that the Red Bull concept is the only concept now. Ferraris and Mercedes didn't work. Ferrari and Mercedes have continued over the winter. And they've taken a step back, even though they've had an extra winter break to develop it further and iron out the issues. And the fact, as you already said, Aston Martin is one of the teams that were the earlier teams to adopt Red Bull last season, and have now overtaken the other two concepts, proves that those concepts should be abandoned. And if they really want to, Ferrari and Mercedes will need to try and copy a Red Bull inspired concept that obviously they can develop and they get their own returnal gains, because obviously as I've said before, you never want to just copy a opposition because you only ever be as fast as the opposition. So but the basis for the concept needs to be there and then develop it. And I feel that it's to the point that they need to be looking at doing that, because as you said, this year is already potentially going to be a loss for both of them, and they're going to be starting from behind, and that's writing off. Even if they brought in this B spec car for next race, that's already this season written off, and potentially even next season. So it's a lot to accept as a team that their chosen unique concept isn't going to work. But if Aston Martin can leapfrog Mercedes and Ferrari, and other teams that are further ahead of Mercedes and Ferrari in the Red Bull concept, who are operating at maximum budget, or I don't know, have the resources available, but still operating the maximum of the budget cap. And you have a steep development curve. You could easily see them by the end of the season, Mercedes and Ferrari maybe find themselves being leapfrogged by other teams. So it is a really something that they should be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can talk about Ferrari a little bit later on. I just want to read a tweet from Brad Philpott, one of the panel from Missed Apex podcast. For those of you that are listening to that one, he had his thoughts on Mercedes concept, and he basically came out with this, and I'm going to quote his tweet here. He said, "Imagine if, instead of wasting a year pursuing a flawed concept, Mercedes had spent that time and money on developing a Red Bull-style philosophy like Aston Martin. With their resource and technical abilities an advantage over Aston Martin, surely they'd have been miles ahead of where Aston Martin have ended up. And that would, of course, have been somewhere in between them and Red Bull, which would have been so much better, at the very minimum, than what everybody else on the grid has been able to achieve right now." I mean, you can't really argue the logic behind that. And of course, questions are going to have to be asked at Mercedes. How far did they go to consider that? Because I was of the opinion that I was expecting to see Mercedes abandon this concept. I know Mercedes have talked about some big upgrades which may change the concept of their car, or at least the side pods, which of course have been a bit of a scapegoat of this flawed concept that they have right now. So I'm as surprised as anyone to see that it's not too different to what it was, and why have Mercedes gone down this route? It is, again, they know better than we do, but right now the stopwatch doesn't lie, and it's more likely, as you said, Lee, that they're going to be overtaken by teams that have adopted this Red Bull concept sooner. They already have done by Aston Martin in a way, than they are to catching the likes of Red Bull.
I've with the Mercedes situation, it almost seems like they've been in a state of denial. So originally, because they had such violent porpoising, everything was getting rattled around, so they couldn't get the data they were looking for, which why it took them such a long time to, gather the data they needed to see the direction that the car's heading in. But surely after that, the writing would have been written on the wall. But yet they still went for this thing of like, oh, we're going to follow our concept. There's something here. There's something here. And they've lost so much time. I know it's easy to say this in hindsight, but for a team that has been as dominant as Mercedes have been since 2014, that have some of the best personnel in the sport, I'm surprised it's taken them this long to see. And it just goes back to my original point. I am personally, as a fan of F1, really disappointed, not only in Mercedes, but also Ferrari, because again, we know these teams have the ability and the potential to give us some great championship battles, and they're not giving us it. Like, if anything, they're falling behind. And now Aston Martin are coming along. I know my tone has been really negative, but I just expect so much more from these teams, and they're not delivering right now.
I suppose the question is that you have to ask to the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari in this instance is, are they concerned, or are they writing themselves off in being able to beat Red Bull at their own game by the fact that Red Bull have an advantage in knowledge of this concept and design theory and research and everything else that comes to it, that even with the ATR regulations favouring them on development time advantages, even more so by the fact that Red Bull breached the cost cap last season, obviously have their own time mitigated even further, they just don't feel that they're able to catch up by the end of this regulation set. And this is something that I ask because I feel teams were doing that with Mercedes. I feel that before, I just felt that teams realised that they couldn't beat Mercedes at their own game, so they decided to stick to a different way of doing things in the hope that it would work. Eventually, Red Bull managed to do it, but of course, a lot of things changed and had to happen in terms of regulation changes, not as big as what we saw in 22, but 2020 to 2021, for example, that did swing things in the balance, which probably wouldn't have done if they'd have left things alone. So you have to factor that into play and almost give teams the benefit of the doubt in that regard. But either way, you're going to lose no matter what you do. So you got to try something. I don't know, but
can I just say like one more thing? There are many pros to this cost cap budget, and I'm all for it because I want to be seeing as many teams catch up as possible. Like, because we've said it a million times, even though people in the comments still can't seem to comprehend this, even though we have our favorite drivers and teams, we are predominantly fans of the sport and we want to be seeing great battles. And yet again, we're not getting it. And I feel this is the one downside of the cost cap, is that if a team runs away with it the way that Red Bull are, because of the limits in the finances, it's difficult for other teams to put throw the money in to put like the research and the development needed to catch up. And that's why we're kind of seeing a flat line, or sometimes other teams falling back. So that's why maybe this is the downside of the cost cap we're seeing right now. One team at the front, whilst the others sort of like colluding. You're gonna have like the A team, and then the rest of them have a B and maybe the odd C at the back. You know, maybe like an AlphaTauri at the back, maybe a Haas when they usually have their drop off at the end of the season. It's like we're gonna have almost two separate formulas because the budget is maybe limiting the other teams from catching up.
Well, one thing I want to add on to or counter that, Courtney, is we know the FA like to interfere, and the FA never likes a team that dominates, unless it was Ferrari, because they're very keen when Ferrari was dominating.
Bring it back.
But what they
been
could
too long.
Sorry, I didn't mean to poke an open wound there.
It's just I'm good. I'm used to it now. It's been like nearly 2 decades, so yeah, we're good.
Yeah, that's good. But what I was saying is, if they get to the situation that they feel that one team is dominating too much, I'm sure there's capacity in the FAA to revisit the ATR regulations regarding the development time and wind tunnel time to give an even bigger advantage to lower teams. I mean, that's just me thinking, but I'm sure that they've got the capacity there to amend the rules to give more potential to the lower finishing championship teams. So, obviously, that's just me speaking, but knowing rule sets in the FAA, I'm sure that could happen.
Well, we saw that, didn't we? We saw them attempt to change the rules during the Mercedes dominance. We saw them try 3 or 4 times to slow down Mercedes, and it didn't work. They pretty much got what they want in 2021, and then they just went crazy, and they went, we're basically going to target every single one of Mercedes strengths to these regulation changes, and Red Bull have just taken full advantage. And this is a fundamental issue with Formula One, is that they go for like these almost desperate attempts to slow a team down, but then another one just comes along. We've seen it in Formula One. We could, over the last 20 odd years, we've been seeing this, and it's something that the FIA need to take a step back and think, look, if we keep on doing the same thing and we're getting the same results, so maybe they need to have a look at their own strategy when it comes to the long-term future of the sport.
I think in a way you could argue, and this goes into, this adds into why Red Bull have been so good at these sort of things, is that, we had 3 different concepts starting with this regulation set. We had the Red Bull one, the Ferrari one, and the Mercedes one. We all knew that there was always going to be one that was going to champion the other 2. We just didn't realise that Red Bull's one in particular was going to be so good and have so much potential. But bear in mind, even if Red Bull have allocated more time to their 2023 car than the other 2 teams did, because of course Mercedes were developing like crazy in 2022 to play catch up. Ferrari were, Ferrarying. They were good at the start, but they didn't capitalise on their advantage when they had it. And, we don't know what they were doing for 2023. They're obviously worried about other ailments, which they haven't really fully rectified yet, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. It does get to a point where one team has done so well with their concept and everyone else is just now going to fall in line and try and do the same thing. You really do put yourself on the back foot. So I do think the regulations are doing what they're intending to do. It's just unfortunately because of the parity in concept design. Bear in mind, they were hoping that the rules were going to produce 10 or close, almost identical cars.
Right.
That didn't happen. We ended up with a lot of variation, which of course for fans was great from an aesthetics perspective. But if you want close, randomized racing to a certain degree, you're not going to get that unless these concepts produce the same results. And evidently speaking, right now, they're not. We should move on because otherwise we're going to end up with a topic on a completely different kind of episode that we could do on this one. Looking at Mercedes' performance in the race, there was a lot of variation in terms of their performance between Hamilton and Russell. In the early stages of the race, Hamilton looked like he was struggling. Russell looked like he was faster than Hamilton. But as the race went on, Sir Lewis Hamilton, all fair play to him, I think he did a pretty good job. Even though he lost out to Fernando Alonso, he couldn't quite get past Carlos Sainz, probably because the Ferrari had a bit more straight line speed advantage, which allowed Sainz to keep Hamilton behind. But I don't think you can really poke too many holes in the performance from Hamilton. I guess in some ways, Russell will be disappointed that Stroll got him at the end as well.
Yeah, Lewis's performance was just yet another polished performance from obviously a guy that's seen it all, done it all. And obviously the finishing position is the is the thing that gets to headlines, but Lewis did a very solid job. And I think in a way, look, we're only one race in, but I think it just backs the theory that Lewis isn't a finished driver. He put in a very, very solid performance, because now they're no longer doing this whole porpoising research, which really put Lewis on the back foot in the first half of 2022. We're now seeing a lot more consistent level performance from Lewis. So I'm just hoping that these kind of performances continue from Lewis, and they'll be putting those doubters to sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on now, because we're half an hour in almost, and we've been ranting on about Mercedes for most of it. And I'm sure Red Bull fans are probably thinking, oh, well, I wanted you guys to talk about Red Bull. We'd love to. We just didn't see much of them today because they were so bloody good. So
it was a good job.
Yeah, exactly. Well done, Red Bull. If no one had told us you guys had won the race, we wouldn't have known, because we were watching everybody else. That's just the coverage, unfortunately. So, yeah, fair play. They were bloody brilliant, those Red Bulls there. Anyway, let's move on. Aston Martin. Now, guys, we were so excited by... I know exactly, Lee. I think my compliments exactly on that one. You know, round of applause for Aston Martin. Phenomenal job. And you got to say, I know a lot of us were expecting Aston Martin to make some step forward, but I cannot remember seeing a team making as big a leap forward as what they did over a winter break. Well, yes, relatively speaking, if you like, but that was a new regulation set, so I think you can...
Okay.
I'm thinking probably the best one I've seen since Mercedes in 2013. I think
that was a new regulation. No,
it wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
There we go. I've got one on you there, Lee, for wheel knowledge. So, but no, obviously moving from sixth best team all the way to second, and you know, challenging Red Bull and winning that Hungarian Grand Prix, they were brilliant. But to Aston Martin, no, fair play. They were absolutely phenomenal this weekend. The pre-season testing pace certainly proved to be the real deal. Fernando Alonso especially. I mean, I'll tell you what, I've not seen Fernando Alonso so happy driving a Formula One car since he did that outing in the 2005 Renault at the Abu Dhabi circuit a few years ago for a bit of nostalgia purposes. And he was mighty. If in a way, he was almost a little bit too overexcited with some of the moves he was pulling off, and almost a little bit overzealous. But what did you make of them this weekend, guys? I mean, incredible stuff, and to get the podium as well.
Look, I said it with the preseason predictions. I'm not gonna lie, I'm feeling quite smug right now, because I did put a risk into this Aston Martin call, but at this point it seems to be going my way. But the reason why, obviously, I had no like background information. I don't have like links to the people at Aston Martin. But the reason why I was so bullish about Aston Martin this season was the circumstances surrounding Fernando Alonso's move. It reminded me a lot of when Lewis left McLaren, who were, the third best team around the time, to Mercedes, who were languishing in midfield. Sort of similar circumstances. Alpine last season looked like the team with more potential. He left abruptly, and there were a lot of question marks. And I thought, he knows something that we don't. And right now, that definitely seems to be the case. Aston Martin have always been ambitious. Obviously, they're going to be having a complete infrastructure revamp, which is actually going to help their cause even more moving forwards. But the fact they've come forwards so dramatically in a short space of time, in one sense, I'm surprised, but I had suspicions the moment Fernando was so keen to join them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Fernando has taken gambles in his career, and, you know, honestly, none of them have paid off for him in the way he would have hoped to. If anything, they were big mistakes. At some point in his career, he was going to get one right. It looks like he may have done that with Aston Martin. Now, look, let's not get carried away. Right now, because of how great Red Bull are at the moment, it's unlikely that Fernando Alonso is going to win the World Championship this season. He may, on a strange day where Red Bull have problems, he might be able to win a Grand Prix or two. We'll have to wait and see, and what a sight that will be. But, you know, fair play to Aston Martin. They abandoned their concept design very early in 2022. They followed the Red Bull example. I remember the Spanish Grand Prix when they bought their first big upgrade in 2022, the Red Bull-like side pods. There were jokes being made about it being the green Red Bull. I think even Christian Horner went as far as drinking a green can of Red Bull just to throw some shade at Red Bull over what they were doing. But, you know, you gotta look at what they did and just think, well, if Aston Martin want to try and produce the best car possible, maybe they do need to take lessons from the team that has got the best car on the grid. They're certainly not going to beat them right now, but they're going to do a good job and probably beat almost everybody else, and they certainly did today. Fernando Alonso in particular, I think we've got to talk about the way he drove today. I mean, he had that first lap incident where his teammate nearly took him out of the race, and I think it was a good thing that Aston Martin didn't tell him who it was that nearly clipped him in Lance Stroll. But he ended up going on. He was quite patient in his build-up. I think he was looking after his tyres quite methodically early on, especially on the hard tyre stint. Did the overcut on both the stints, and it paid off massively for him. And he was incredibly fast at the end, where he not only got Lewis Hamilton, he also got Carlos Sainz as well. Some great overtaking. The move he pulled off on Sir Lewis Hamilton going into the double left-hander at turn 9 and 10 was brilliant from Fernando.
It was some classic Fernando driving, and really enjoyable to see him up towards the sharp end where he belongs compared to where he's languished in the last few years, or even McLaren days further down. So it was really, really enjoyable to see him was driving and all his appetite for winning still there. Although it does come to mind that I've never seen Fernando or heard Fernando be so nice. He was asking about Lance and thank you for the car. The car's brilliant. It's like, what's going on? Fernando's being so nice.
Well, this is it. I mean, Stoppel Van Dorn, I think it was, that was saying about Fernando that he uses 25% of his brain to drive and the other 75% to, think about other things going on in the race, or think about this or think about that. It's quite nice to see Fernando's radio messages where he's quite happy. He was saying happy birthday to one of the crew members at the team. That was their 60th birthday they were celebrating. He was in such good spirits. And I think when he passed Carlos Sainz, it was quite funny when he just said, bye-bye. It was really good to see. None of the GP2 engine stuff, which of course we all love for different reasons because it's comical, it's Fernando, it's box office. But no, it was absolutely brilliant to see. And it was nice to see him checking up on his teammate, trying to cheer him on, hope he can get a big result, beat the Mercs if he could. Ultimately, Stroll just didn't have enough time or tyres or the pace to get that, but even he put a great performance in. And I think we should also, applaud Lance Stroll, a driver that I don't think many of us expected to see drive this weekend, but he put a great performance in, despite the fact that by his own admission, he had broken both of his wrists and his toe beforehand. And there was even photos doing the rounds on social media suggesting that he was struggling to get in and out of the car properly. So despite all of that, to come P6 and put a whole race distance together, fair play to Lance Stroll as well. Everything on the up for Aston Martin is the takeaway here.
Yeah, fair play to Lance. It was concerning to see that he wasn't able to get out the car, because if he was to have an accident, similar to Monte Grosjean had a couple of seasons ago, it would have obviously been very dicey for him. But all things considered, he also put in a great performance. You got to remember, he obviously wasn't involved. He wasn't involved in testing, was he? Was it Dragovic done all the testing, didn't
he? Yeah.
So he had no involvement in testing. I don't know if that's not only because of Lance, but of how exceptionally good this Aston Martin is, that it's just very easy to you could just jump in and get stuck in right away. I think it's a combination of both. So I think this highlights a credit not only to the Aston Martin car and the team that put it together, but also both of their drivers today.
Yeah, absolutely. Lee, what did you make of Lance Stroll's performance this weekend?
I mean, I don't say it very often about Lance, but it was a very impressive drive from him. Just the fact that he could put a whole race distance 12 days after his surgery. And a good performance at that. Really hats off to him on what he achieved today. And obviously, a slight concern about the safety aspects of him going out of the car. So I'm surprised the FA allowed him to do that, but I'm sure that they would have done their checks beforehand for him to be happy that he could evacuate the car in a timely fashion if there was such an emergency. Because obviously safety is paramount. They wouldn't let him out, wouldn't let him race if he couldn't pass their safety tests. But yeah, just really, really impressive, solid drive. And I look forward to seeing what he could actually achieve in that car once he's fully recovered. Because at the moment, it's like he's got his asterisks, that he's got his 2 broken wrists, and give him a couple of weeks fully recovered, and be really interesting how close he is to Fernando.
Well, it just goes to show how impressive athletes Formula One drivers really are. I mean, they're quite often overlooked compared to other athletes in other sports because people just say, oh, well, they drive a car, it does all the work for them. You don't have to be that impressive an athlete. But if anyone that follows Lewis Hamilton on Instagram, whenever he takes a topless photo, can see, actually, this guy's the real deal. You know, for an example, Lance Stroll in this case, of course, as you mentioned, Lee, 12 days after surgery, getting back in a Formula One car and doing a full race weekend. Yes, he had that minor incident with his teammate. No harm done in the end. They managed to crack on with their race, and Stroll managed to get ahead of George. Did he get ahead of George Russell in the end? He did. Yeah. So there you go. I mean, shows he's got the pace, and it also confirms how good the Aston Martin really is. It's not just Fernando Alonso doing the business, Lance Stroll doing it as well, and the team will be thrilled about that. Got a spare thought for Felipe Drugovich as well. Not just because I put him as my bold prediction to get points this weekend when he didn't even drive, but it did seem all the while that Felipe Drugovich was going to be driving the car this weekend, making his debut. Understandably, he was quite annoyed and upset about that, but you know, if Lance is going to pass the medical checks more than almost any other driver on the grid, they're going to want him driving that car. You know, that's the reality when your dad owns the team. He's going to do everything possible to make sure that you're driving, unless the FIA say it's not safe to do so. So hopefully Felipe can just take it on the chin, do what he's got to do there, and maybe the opportunity will come up in the future at Aston Martin or maybe somewhere else. We'll have to wait.
I just want to also add poor Sebastian, if you're watching the race.
I don't think Seb will be that bothered. I think he'd have known what Aston were doing, and even so it's not like he retired not knowing how good this car was going to be. But even
would it be nice to see?
Yeah, but even then, I think we can throw a caveat in that Fernando probably, with all respect to Seb, Fernando probably would have got more out of that car than Seb anyway. So there is that extra dynamic as well, and that's not me throwing shade at Seb. I think from what we've seen for Fernando, the desire and the hunger, and the fact that Fernando still runs around like he's a 21-year-old at Minardi, you know, ready and raring to go in F1, and he's 41, 2 world championships and many Grand Prix later, he still wants to try and achieve big things. So no, fair play to him. Let's move on to Ferrari. Similar to the Mercedes story, the car not as fast as they were hoping it would be. Good over one lap, but similar issues with the tyre deg affecting him over the course of the race. Charles Leclerc, to his credit, was driving a very, very good race, executed the strategy to the best of his ability. Unfortunately, reliability, the one Achilles heel Ferrari had from last season, still rising its ugly head in the worst way possible. Now, going into this race, Charles Leclerc had to have a new energy store battery for Ferrari, and you're only allowed 2 over the course of the season, so any more new ones, that will incur a penalty. The first one is gone back to Maranello for checks. They think it's something that they can salvage and fix, so hopefully they can do that for Ferrari. But whilst we don't know the full reasons for his retirement towards the end of the race today, another reliability issue for Ferrari. After a winter-long period of making promises that they'd sorted the reliability issues out, not only is this Ferrari not quick enough, but it's also not reliable, and that's going to be a big problem if they can't get on top of that this season. It's certainly not Red Bull they have to worry about right now.
Well, yeah, and we all know that the reliability can also limit the performance gains that they can give to the car, because particularly with aerodynamic upgrades, the more streamlined and the less sort of holes, let's say, there are in the car, the more prone it is, or let's say the more compact the car is around the engine, for example, the more likely there is to be strain on all these components. You know, I think sometimes we forget, looking from the outside, how complicated these engines are, and obviously everything else that comes with it. The interior of the cars are so complex, and they're always running on a limit, that if Ferrari continue to have these reliability struggles, it is going to limit how they can develop their car moving forward. So it is a double issue, and it's certainly something that plagued their 2022 season. We know they had to turn the engine power down because of reliability issues. Let's hope that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, very, very true. You know, we talked about Mercedes' concept and how that one seems to be quite flawed, and what they may have to do in order to get back on terms, or at least catch up to Red Bull, or even Aston Martin in this case, rather than the rest of the field. Ferrari are in a similar position. They've gone down a very unique concept design. They stuck to that over the winter break, and I think a lot of us expected them to do so, because obviously the deficit to Red Bull was not as big as Mercedes' deficit was in that regard. And Ferrari have ended up in a very similar position to Mercedes. They're probably a little bit closer to Red Bull than Mercedes are, but they're in the same boat in that regard. They're worrying about Aston Martin. The pace is there from Aston Martin and what they've done. Ferrari, like Mercedes, have the resource, the technology and everything else, where if they wanted to do what Red Bull did, they'd probably be a lot further along and a lot closer to Red Bull than where they were today. What do Ferrari do, Lee? Do they have to consider ripping up their concept, or is there still room for this Ferrari to find gains which can bring them back into a position where they can fight for race wins again and maybe even a world championship?
Well, I think the first thing they need to do before they think about concept is resolve their reliability. The fact that they get through multiple engine components on the first race means they're already going to be effectively out of the championship fight. If they're using up these components, or they've already had it, and if it's the power unit has failed in Charles' car or another component, and that's the first race, that he would have potentially got through two components. So resolving that is be the key thing. But on the concept, it really down to what they think their development curve is. Obviously, if they go for a new concept, the development curve will be greater because of more potential to unlock. But if they already think that at the end of their concept that they're not going to unlock that much potential and they're already half a second away from Red Bull, how likely do they think they'll close that gap? As I said with the Mercedes, I think they're going to have to quickly come to the decision this year if they're going to copy the Red Bull, because they're going to be watching their back at Alpine or Alfa Romeo or Williams, who performing strongly this weekend. And you never know, you could be finding that Mercedes and Ferrari are fighting the midfield all of a sudden and not challenging the top two, not calling them the top three anymore, because at the moment they're not. It's Ferrari had a disappointing weekend and are fourth in the Constructors' Championship, which is really not what they expected coming into this weekend.
No, it's interesting you mention that though. Sorry, Adam. It's interesting you mention that, Lee. Like, look at McLaren. McLaren are a team that some of the bigger teams need to look at with alarm bells. McLaren are an example of what can happen to a team if they sleepwalk, because this is what I feel Ferrari and Mercedes are doing at the moment. We saw McLaren do it in 2014. They were sleepwalking, they got desperate and ended up at the back of the grid, and they're still in recovery mode. Have a look at Williams as well. Was Williams, okay, they made a slight recovery over the last year or so, but Williams went from, in the 90s, being a championship dominant team to being on the brink of bankruptcy, because sometimes these teams rely on their recent history and their name. Oh, we'll be okay, we'll be okay. Sometimes no, sometimes you have to make big decisions. Formula One is such, what's probably the best way to describe it, an unforgiving beast. It doesn't lie back. We know that a tenth of a second can make such a difference. So it doesn't matter what your name is, what your history is, what your prestige is. You have to be in the now, or pretty much looking ahead. In Formula One more than anywhere else. So they have to look at McLaren as an example of what happens if you carry on sleepwalking.
I mean, I don't think it's that bad a situation, Ferrari. I mean, I know they're not in a great place. I think they're a little bit better in terms of where they are compared to Mercedes in terms of performance. Obviously, reliability is still an issue at play here, and if you don't finish, you're not going to score points. So obviously that's a problem. But with the resources and people and everything else available to Ferrari, they've been in positions where they have slumped, but they've been able to recover very quickly. I think the last few years have shown that when they were in a very bad place, the next season after that, after finishing P6, they would end up P3. The year later, they were fighting for a championship for at least half the season. So, you know, Ferrari can recover very, very quickly from these difficult situations. But of course, timing is everything, and making the right decision at the right time is key. Fred Vasseur probably wouldn't have anticipated being in such a difficult position as early as this. This would have been something, I think, if Mattia Binotto was still running the team, Ferrari may have decided to think, actually, we're not going to wait till the end of 2023, we'll get rid of you now. But obviously that already happened. So Fred Vasseur is obviously going to be afforded more time than that, but he's going to have a big decision to make on what Ferrari do going forward. I do want to talk about Carlos Sainz briefly before we move on to some of the other stories this weekend. I'm a bit concerned about his pace this weekend, because it's very easy to say, oh, well, Ferrari's car wasn't great, tyre deg was terrible, reliability was terrible. But in the race, Carlos Sainz was 12 to 15 seconds, give or take, throughout the entirety of that race, slower behind his teammate. And one thing we won't know from this race is how close Fernando Alonso would have been to Charles Leclerc for a podium position if Leclerc hadn't retired from the race. What we do know is not only was Carlos Sainz 10 seconds behind Fernando, but he could have been even further behind Charles Leclerc. So is there an element from this weekend to take away that Carlos Sainz probably didn't deliver as well as he could have done compared to his teammate, for example, who looked like the best of the rest until he retired?
Yeah, I think from a performance, there may be issues that we're not made aware of, but the fact that such a big gap before Charles's retirement between Charles and Carlos is a worrying thing. So obviously you want to be as close to your teammate as possible, and a 12-second gap is massive gap to have between teammates in the same car. Carlos obviously started off strong, but then he just seemed to fall away. Like Charles fell away from Max and Sergio. Carlos just couldn't keep up with what Charles was doing. And obviously, if this is replicated over the season, it's such a big worrying gap between the two drivers that the questions will be asked of Carlos of why he's not able to have a closer gap to Charles.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those where, I have the utmost faith that Carlos Sainz is going to be able to deliver Ferrari when they need him to. But on an afternoon like this, even though Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso were brilliant, I think Ferrari would have at least expected if Charles Leclerc had a reliability issue that he himself would have been able to pick up the spoils and get that podium. He didn't do that. They were asking him on the radio, look, protect this position at all costs. And he said, well, if I do that, the tyres aren't going to last. But if you look at the strategy, I don't really think the strategy was pushing Carlos Sainz, even with the Ferrari tyre deg issues that they have, to push on those hard tyres any more than probably what they were capable of. I mean, the pace drop-off was quite immense for him on that final stint. So that is something to worry about. Again, it's something that we won't know if that's a car issue or if it was just Sainz in those conditions. Again, as I said, the Bahrain circuit is very abrasive and it exaggerates strengths and weaknesses of cars alike. So it may just be a one-off, but it's certainly something that Carlos is going to have to think about, because for a lot of that race, Charles Leclerc was in another league to him, with all due respect. So we'll have to wait and see. Let's move on to a team we already brought up recently, McLaren. Very tough day. Probably the worst day of any team. We expected McLaren to struggle with this Grand Prix, but reliability issues for Piastri ruining his debut, and otherwise he was pretty good, all things considered. Lando Norris doing Lando Norris things, being incredibly good, but again, the car just letting him down. It's not only fast, but not only slow, but it's not very reliable either. So worrying signs ahead for McLaren.
Yeah, not only on the pure performance part, but also the reliability. The Mercedes engine has had its many flaws in the past year or so, but reliability has been its biggest trait. So the fact that they thought it's an engine problem, it's more likely to be caused by the concept that McLaren are going with, putting a strain on the engine. So it's very concerning for McLaren. And look, I said it before, Lando Norris must be wanting out now. He must. Again, it's just one. It's a 3-day test and one race. But he must be thinking, where's this team going? Because it doesn't look like it's heading in the right direction right now.
I understand that point. The obvious question is, where would he go right now? There doesn't seem to be I mean, as I said, we're one race in. We can't really speculate on this too much, any more than we would have done over the winter break. So I'm sure... I don't know what Lando Norris is thinking right now. Perhaps he is looking around and thinking, what other options are available to me if it doesn't work out McLaren. I suppose we're going to know the answer to a lot of these questions with McLaren for the 2023 season, is how the car is going to look, feel, and drive, more importantly, when the big raft of upgrades that they have promised will come around about Baku or Spain, for example. We'll have to wait and see there. I mean, on the subject of Oscar Piastri, guys, I know he had some real misfortune in qualifying. He did pretty well for a while in the race. Obviously, the reliability was a concern, but when he was on track, despite not having driven been racing properly for best part of almost 18 months, if you think about it, he didn't do too badly, did he?
No, we know the potential's there, but it's unlikely he's going to have the car to showcase it anytime soon. So there are many reasons for us to want to see McLaren get back up there, and seeing the potential that we all know that Oscar Piastri has is definitely one of the reasons why we want to see him get up there.
Lee, what did you make of Oscar Piastri this weekend? I mean, as I said, qualifying looked pretty good. Obviously, it was unfortunate not to go through, but the car probably wasn't really capable of getting out Q1, except for what Lando did. But yeah, it wasn't a bad debut for Oscar, all things considered.
It wasn't a bad debut. I personally expected him to be slightly closer, but that was just my personal opinion on that. But it wasn't a bad performance that he delivered, and it was just obviously a shame that he didn't get to do a full race distance on his first go. And obviously the car let him down. I'm sure he must be wondering, why didn't I take Alpine? Why did I have to join McLaren? But it's just me jesting. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing what he can deliver in the future races, to be honest.
Yeah, a lot of people were citing that he was like nearly half a second off Lando in qualifying, but I mean, we're taking Lando's fastest lap in Q2 when the track was ramping up, and you know the conditions would have been better for him because I think Lando put it P11 in qualifying or something like that, something crazy that he shouldn't have been able to do, and yet he managed it because Lando is just brilliant. And that's what he does right now. So I think that was a little bit unfair because in Q1 they were only like a tenth apart, and obviously Lando got through just about, you know, beating Logan Sargent into Q2 and after setting the same time and Lando setting it first. So I think Oscar would be fairly satisfied with how he performed. I'm sure there's plenty more to come from him. But yeah, not a good weekend for McLaren at a track where a lot of their shareholders are obviously based. So not a good look for them. Let's move on to Alpine, seeing as we mentioned them. A very contrasting race for both their drivers. It started off well for Ocon. You know, he was running pretty well in the race. Obviously, he'd made his first mistake by parking too far into his grid box, which got him a penalty early on. We'll go on that in a minute. But we want to talk about Pierre Gasly's debut for Alpine. You know, as I said, qualifying didn't go according to plan for him. He struggled there, but as the race went on, did pretty well, made his way through the field. Then the virtual safety car came out, went into the pits on the soft tyres, managed to drag his way up to P9. I think that's a pretty good effort from Pierre Gasly, all things considered. And those are the performances I think Alpine are certainly going to hope that he can deliver on a regular basis in a season where obviously they have fallen away a little bit in terms of that leading midfield fight.
I think what a great set of circumstances for Pierre's first weekend to go. Obviously, qualifying was a disaster. So for him to be in that position and then recover the way he did, that was a great opportunity for him to demonstrate what he can offer the team. So there's already going to be a positive buzz surrounding Pierre Gasly. So yeah, fantastic start for him.
Absolutely. Can I just say on a random thought with Alpine, I know they want to attribute themselves with blue, you know, the French tricolour colours and everything else, but I think that car looks great, pink. Can they just keep it that way for the rest of the year, guys?
I fully agree. I'm all for the pink.
Yeah. What do you reckon, Lee?
Yeah. No, I do agree. I do prefer the pink over the blue Alpine. But yeah, obviously they're not going to do that for our national pride, etc. Would you have a pink Ferrari if their sponsors requested it? So I think it's as much as we would like it, I don't think that would happen.
Yeah, I mean, Ferrari probably try and get away with it by like having the reddish shade of pink that you could find. I mean, you could paint the Red Bull pink. You'd never see it because the TV directors won't pick up on it until Max wins the race at the end because he's so good at the moment. So, yeah, we'll see. I mean, Esteban Ocon's race, of course, he said on the radio he couldn't believe how these penalties were being awarded to him because he does this stuff all the time. I mean, I certainly hope that's not the case. I'm just going to read through the itinerary of penalties that he was awarded today. 5 seconds for being in the wrong grid position. He was too far ahead of his grid box, so he got penalised for that. He then went into the pits, and not only was he speeding in the pit lane, but he also got a 10-second penalty for not completing the 5-second penalty properly. As you can see in the pit box, the mechanics were putting on radiators to cool down the brakes, and they were trying to unscrew the front wing a little bit early because he had the front left panel on his front wing had come loose after a bit of contact, I think with Hulkenberg earlier on in the race or something like that. I think it was Hulkenberg, it might be someone else. But yeah, obviously had an issue with that. And then got a 5-second penalty on top of that for, 10 seconds for the 5-second penalty violation and 5 seconds for speeding in the pit lane. So a dismal afternoon for Esteban Ocon, and hopefully he won't have many more like that over the course of the season.
No, if he carries on like that, it's going to be a disaster. Not only for the sake of the team, but also we've been saying many a time that we expect the inter-team battle between him and Gasly to be a lot more personal compared to all the others. So if they continue to have the contrasting weekends the way they have, Ocon's going to find himself on the back foot very soon.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's move on to Courtney's favourite team. Perk him up a little bit, Alfa Romeo.
Oh, just what I needed.
Another team that's had some contrasting fortunes this weekend. Valtteri Bottas in P8. Bit of a surprise, that one, because Valtteri, what was it, qualified P12, wasn't it? And then he got a great start, moved himself up into the field. He was battling away with the likes of Stroll, Russell and Hamilton and Alonso earlier on. And then obviously had a nice battle there when he extended that opening stint. And he managed to finish a solid P8. Again, it was one of those races for Bottas where if you weren't aware that he was in the race, you wouldn't have known he'd come P8. But again, these are the kind of opportunities where Alfa Romeo, like they did last season, are going to have to pick up some solid points early on. Credit to Valtteri Bottas, he's done it again. Obviously, they're going to need him to do that more often if they're going to finish where they did last season. So, what did you make of his performance? He's still looking good and still driving well.
Yeah, Bottas 8.0 is doing very well. I don't know what number it is. I just said a number. No, it was a very impressive drive from Bottas. I know we said last year that Bottas switched off, but seeing him come back and yes, it's the first race, but just seeing him invigorated again and being raring to race and delivering performances that we know he can do, it's been really enjoyable to see him drive this weekend, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to make a point on Zhou Guanyu because his race, it was kind of a bit topsy-turvy, a little bit messy in places. As I said, we didn't see much of it, but didn't really have the pace of his teammate. And this is something that last season you would have afforded him the luxury of being a rookie, and that over the course of the season he would get better and better and better. And to his credit, he did. Even though the car wasn't performing when he was performing, he really could have done with that form earlier on last season. This is the time he has to demonstrate his performance. And I want to stress that this could be a big season for Zhou to prove that he deserves to be in that team. Obviously, they're going through that transition phase to becoming Audi in 2026. Zhou could be a part of that if he improves long term. It's a big if, but we'll have to wait and see. But in terms of his immediate future, I don't know if he's going to be keeping an eye on this, but Théo Pourchaire this weekend in F2, a driver very much a part of the Sauber program, was brilliant. Brilliant in qualifying on pole position. In the sprint race, things didn't work out. He was a bit too aggressive on his tyres, but recovered so well in the race. He was brilliant in the feature race. Dominated the field, won it by nearly 20 seconds. If Théo Pourchaire continues on that trend this season in F2, there's absolutely every reason that if Zhou's not performing, that he could find himself replaced in 2024. So what do you reckon, guys? Is that something Zhou's going to have on his mind long term? Is that going to potentially affect his performances this week for the season?
100%, because not only do you have the Pourchaire situation, completely agree. Look, you was one of the first people on this podcast, Adam, that was like, look, Pourchaire, we need to keep an eye on this guy. So it's one they've also had in the bank for a few seasons now, but this could well be the season where he really showcases what he can offer an F1 team. There's not only that, but obviously with the Audi takeover, they're going to want to have a breath of fresh air. So both of their drivers are going to have to be careful. And I think we all know the capabilities that Bottas has. So over the course of the season, we know Bottas will do enough to keep that seat. So there will be more pressure on Zhou Guanyu, all things considered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, qualifying 7 tenths quicker than anybody else in qualifying, and that's a big margin in F2. Bear in mind, it's the same spec series. So,
Yeah.
If you're going to pull out that kind of margin in the opening race, everyone else is looking like, wow, that's impressive. So, we'll have to keep an eye on Théo Pourchaire this year. He's certainly going to be knocking on the door. He has done for a couple of years now, but this year he very much looks like he could go on and have a big year in Formula 2. Moving on now to the next team I want to talk about, Williams. And very much emphasising the W in Williams this week. And I think a lot of us going into the season probably thought Williams would be more competitive, but perhaps not capable of scoring points. But they look very quick in qualifying. Alex Albon getting into Q2. Logan Sargent on his debut, just missing out because Lando Norris did the same time as him, but did it first. So obviously by the rules, he weren't able to make it through. Alex Albon solid in the points. Logan Sargent's race pace was very good. Ultimately finished a lap down, but P12, gotta say, Williams looking good right now.
Williams seemed to be in quite a healthy position. Not only because they seem to put together a much more stable car, which seems to be a lot easier to drive compared to last year's, but they seem to be building something really positive surrounding Alex Albon. Both the driver and the team can resonate with each other because they're both on a rebuilding project. So I just feel that they're working in tandem with each other. And I hope this carries on because there haven't been many feel-good stories from the grid this week. But Williams certainly is one. And I'm really hoping, particularly for Alex Albon's sake, that they carry on like this because we saw the opportunities that George Russell had during his time at Williams. And it looks like Alex Albon's doing exactly the same thing. And it'll be giving him that confidence because we know how good Alex Albon can be. And he's such a likeable guy as well. So there'll be a lot of fans of the sport that'll be hoping to see Williams do well this year.
Absolutely. And James Vowles, of course, his first race in charge of the team. Very good start for the new team boss. Logan Sargent, right now, rookie of the season, wouldn't you say, Lee?
Yeah, definitely the rookie of the season at the moment with his performance. It was solid driving it from his part. It's a shame that he did miss out on qualifying. You could argue that based on this race alone, that Williams is being a better car than McLaren, which compared to last year, that's quite a reversal of fortune.
That would have been a bold prediction for one of us to make if
Yeah.
we felt daring. But alas, no, good start for Williams. Hope for their sake it will continue. Certainly a team on the up. Let's talk about AlphaTauri, a team that a lot of us, ourselves included, kind of wrote off before the season even started. Pre-season testing didn't give us much indication. Nearly getting a point, though. And despite the issues that we were concerned about, Yuki Tsunoda drove a pretty good race today. Nick De Vries also drove pretty well. The teams had a bit of a moment between them where they were fighting for P11 and 12. De Vries kind of shafted a little bit on strategy when that virtual safety car came out. Left out on the harder tyres where Tsunoda got a chance to pit on the softer tyres, really gave him the edge over his teammates. So even though the car wasn't that fast, they did pretty well with what they had, and a decent drive from both drivers, it must be said.
Yeah, if you have a look at the back, over the last few seasons, there's always been one team that is right at the back. So in recent years, it was Williams or Haas. It looks like so far, we're not going to get that. We're actually going to have like a bit of a battle to avoid the wooden spoon. So it looks like AlphaTauri look like they're going to be in the mix for that. But yeah, I think there should be encouragement. We all knew that Nick De Vries would do a job for the team. It's just going to be. I feel that AlphaTauri season is going to depend on Yuki Tsunoda, but he made a solid start, so they'll be hoping to see more of that from Tsunoda in the coming races.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of us would have expected Nick De Vries to not have the highs from his second F1 debut as he did in his first one in Monza last season. The seasoned rookie, I think some people have referred to him as, and that's probably a little bit harsh as well because he's only had one race before that. It was always going to be a difficult one today, and I think he did okay under the circumstances. I think if someone had said to him you'd finished P14 and you'd be gutted because you could have been higher if it weren't for a strategy call going against you, then I think he would have taken that one. So not a bad effort from AlphaTauri, it must be said. Hopefully for their sake, they can try and improve as the season goes on. It's going to be tough, but not a bad day for them. Haas as well, we can kind of draw similar conclusions. It was a bit topsy-turvy with Magnussen and Hülkenberg. They were kind of up and down today. Hülkenberg kind of, again, strategy didn't work out for him. Not a bad debut. He looked like he had the edge over Magnussen over the course of the weekend, but Magnussen finishing ahead of him on the track, Lee.
Yeah, definitely very impressive from Nico Hülkenberg in qualifying. And as you said, a very topsy-turvy race. I did find it slightly ironic that obviously one of the reasons Nico was brought into replacement was because of the crashes. And Nico obviously damaged his front wing, which did, which I when it happened, I was like, oh, that's a bit funny.
That's that 250k that they've already saved on the smaller pit wall spent on a new front wing for Hülkenberg already. Schumacher probably sitting there in the Merc garage. If he wasn't trying not to be smiling in front of Toto Wolff because he was standing right next to him, he had to look almost as stern as Toto was. He's like, I can't enjoy this, but yeah, I'm sure you'd have noticed that.
But yeah, I thought that was amusing. But it was a very odd race from the Haas that they thought
Yeah.
they could deliver a lot more than they actually did, and they went backwards, or just management, or just the other teams performed better. I don't know, but it was just really messy. I can't put my finger on why it was so messy.
I think it was just one of those races where, as Courtney had already highlighted, that because the field has closed up, there are going to be less opportunities. I think, well, there's going to be more opportunities, I suppose, for people to take advantage of misfortune or mistakes from other drivers around them. We could see a very randomised midfield this season. I think if you look Alpine all the way down to McLaren, and I don't think McLaren are going to be the worst team this season, but right now they do look in that position, all things considered. It's going to be very, very tight. Red Bull are in a league of their own. Then you've got Aston Martin, Mercedes, Ferrari. Those three are obviously going to swap around depending. I mean, Ferrari probably look best placed right now, but with reliability and tyre data issues, you have to factor that in. Aston Martin were brilliant, and Alonso was brilliant. Mercedes will have their day too, and then you've got everybody else. So it's going to be exciting all the way up and down the field. I suppose, unless you're a Red Bull fan, the hope will be is that somehow the other teams can find a way to catch them. But based on what we saw this weekend, it could be a very, very good season for Red Bull, and in particular, Max Verstappen. But of course, guys, until then, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the next race in Jeddah in 2 weeks' time. Different characteristics on this circuit. We may see some differences in the pecking order. Let's hope for some more exciting action at the front. Let's hope that Aston Martin continue to be the real deal, because I don't know about you guys, I love seeing Fernando Alonso at the sharp end of the grid. So long may that continue. But of course, if you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And of course, don't forget to give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting platform if you think that we are worthy. We really appreciate that. Until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in. Please stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1 or Ferrari. Take care.
See you soon.
Goodbye.